National Affairs and Politics with me, David Gazard from DPG Advisory and Ben Oquist, Executive Director of the Australia Institute. Thanks, gentlemen. We're back here, aren't we? Another lockdown, the federal government having to intervene and a spat erupting. It was all a bit unseemly last night, wasn't it, with the Victorians saying that the Prime Minister was being a Prime Minister for New South Wales only.
I think that's probably born out of the fact that the latest package was tailored for New South Wales, but it's the template for every state. So every state would qualify if they went into the same situation. Victoria's lockdown didn't push it into the realms that New South Wales is currently at, but heaven forbid, I hope no other state goes here. Were they to, they would get exactly what what New South Wales is receiving, with a whole range of payments that ratchet up through the week. So I think
So what's with all the fiery language?
I think it was just a misunderstanding about what was how you qualified and if you did qualify. But Victoria would get exactly the same package as New South Wales were that they go back to lockdown.
Ben, your thoughts on that? Because David is right to say that the way that the federal government responded to this was exactly the same in the first couple of weeks, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think the problem is, however you cut it, the rhetoric towards Victoria has been different, hasn't it? And there was a lot more criticism coming out of Canberra for Victoria's lockdown compared to New South Wales. Even Frydenberg, when he was explaining the differences, he said, well, New South Wales fessed up to its what went wrong with its quarantine, and Victoria never has. He keeps saying if Victoria had an inquiry and they didn't find anybody was at fault. And that's really weird compared to New South Wales. What struck me about that, first of all, is that he's right to say that you should fess up and own up to mistakes. And I don't think the Commonwealth does that at all, read this crisis. So I think the public is willing to be a bit forgiving. There will be mistakes. It is complicated. It is difficult. It is uncharted territory. It is a pandemic. But we're not ever hearing that from the Commonwealth. Quick to blame, never fessing up to mistakes that they made, vaccine rollout, quarantine. I think Morrison would be better off if he took that kind of conciliatory role. And I think he'd be better if he took the conciliatory role with the states. I don't think the rhetoric towards Victoria is good for him. One last thing. I think the sting about him being the Prime Minister for New South Wales from Victoria can bite and can hurt him. And I think it's a product of him spending too much time in Sydney. He should be here in Canberra. Canberra was a compromise of the Federation, and in fact it's an enduring compromise, and he should spend more time in Canberra. He should be living at the Lodge full time, and that would make him Prime Minister for Australia and not being able to be pinned as Prime Minister for New South Wales, as Dan Andrew has done. The Canberra bubble is great. No COVID here at the moment. Spend time in Canberra. Parliament's got to sit in 2 weeks' time. He's got to come back here and quarantine and be better off here.
I extend the hand of goodwill to Ben. I think he's right, and I think
elbow.
Ben will get his...
We'll do the elbow.
He will get his... Yeah, extend the elbow, that's right. He'll get his way with the Prime Minister returning to Canberra in the very near future. The thing I would say is this. I mean, as this has rolled on for 18 months, a range of different scenarios have transpired, haven't they? I mean, this has not been dynamic. What we're facing now is the Delta variant, which has added another layer of complexity across what has already been a difficult global response. The idea that the states and territories and federal government would sit around holding hands and agreeing on everything through every circumstance is fanciful. The situation Victoria and New South Wales face now is totally different from what happened 6-8 months ago, where clearly New South Wales had better contact tracing. And the federal government was trying to help all the other states get into a position where they could contact trace like the gold standard.
But they did have a crack. They had a crack at the Andrews government on various occasions. And is that going to blow back at them in the political sense?
That was then, this is now. I mean, we're now faced with a new variant, right, that's more infectious. No one wants any state to go back into it. Do we want the best standard of each state to be replicated across the other states? Yeah, we do. We want to encourage that. And sometimes that's going to take a little bit of jawboning. Now, I think we get to a better outcome because of that. But let's not forget either that, and as long as I've been around, right, I've worked for a New South Wales Prime Minister, I've worked for a Victorian Treasurer. There is always parochial jawboning going on between those states. They compete with each other. In the same way, we're looking at the Blues Maroons in state of origin. There's always jostling between those states. Healthy competition. We live in a federalist model.
Tell you what, though, it could be damaging in an election year.
And this is where National Cabinet has sat over the top, and we've all worked together really well despite differences.
Ben?
You wouldn't want to be Gladys Liu at the moment. I do think there's a danger for the Prime Minister.
The member for Chisholm.
Yeah, the member for Chisholm. Probably the only seat that the coalition is at risk of losing in Victoria. You can't help thinking that there's politics at play here. There's not as much electoral risk for the coalition in Victoria. Overall, though, I'll go back to the big issue, is that you need a government and a Prime Minister who's able in a crisis like this to say mistakes we made, we've made some, I'm fessing up to them, here's how we're going to fix the vaccine rollout. And I think the Prime Minister can come across too belligerent and too attacking the states, and that's not going to help.
The vaccine rollout, of this scenario that the government puts about 1 million from the second half of this month, so pretty much as we speak, 1 million Pfizer a week for the next few months. These numbers are going to climb.
Yep.
I know we're in a very difficult situation at the moment with Sydney,
Yep.
and leaking into Victoria with a few cases. But a few months down the track, and let's hope that Gladys Berejiklian's got a lid on that outbreak, then the numbers will be much greater than they are now. Do you see a scenario, you've been around this place a long time, where we all look back and think, well, yeah, it was a headache, but the government has got us here. The economy's firing once again, and they're the favourites to win the election.
I think that's what the Prime Minister's hoping. It is surprising in the middle of this crisis that the Prime Minister is not kind of further ahead politically. Like the experience is, if it's vaguely competent, incumbents are rewarded. Certainly, state premiers have been rewarded. The vaccine rollout hasn't gone well. Everyone admits that. 12% fully vaccinated is not good enough. But if he can start looking like the Prime Minister for Australia, get living in the lodge full time, and the vaccination rollout goes better, you are going to forget it. But he can't continue fights, I don't think, with the premiers going into an election. It can't be 8 against 1. I think that'll be a real political difficulty.
And I know that he is trying to, and David, you know, through the National Cabinet and his language, he's trying to appear above the fray. But for the Labor premiers, it's in their interest to drag him back in for a stink.
I tend to favour that position. The National Cabinet has functioned in a unified way throughout, really, the pandemic, in a way that we've never had to test before, really. It's back to kind of war cabinet footings, but it's involved the states. It's been interesting that the states that have gone to state elections and have won are the ones that have been the most critical of the federal government's rollout, which is now 30% of the population's covered and speeding up. I mean, the one thing I would say is you can focus on the mistakes, but this was a global crisis. No one knew the way forward. Everyone has struggled. Every leader in the world has struggled. Australia has done extraordinarily well on an international comparison. Our death rates have been far, far lower than most comparable countries, most developed OECD countries. Our economy has rebounded far faster.
Good government action.
This has been due to the leadership of all of the governments across Australia.
Exactly.
And with the Prime Minister chairing
it's not showing
National
up
Cabinet.
in the polls,
No,
the Prime Minister.
there is no doubt. There are people that are frustrated after 18 months. But I think also once that's explained to them and they see what happened as Pfizer was announced, where are we going to end up? Hang on, Ben. We're going to end up in a situation, if things go according to plan now, where we actually got to test our vaccines rather than jam them out in an emergency. We'll be 2 months behind where we were. Now, most reasonable Australians would say, yeah, they encountered difficulties. You could call them mistakes. Where do we end up? We're safer than most countries. Our economy responded. We're in jobs. We're fully vaccinated, and it might have taken 2 months. That is a reasonable proposition.
Just quickly, I think he could have done better at owning all that if there hadn't been such criticism of the states and their lockdowns. The reality is there was no trade-off between health and the economy. Australia is living proof that if you look after the health response, you'll get an economic response matched with a $300 billion injection from the Commonwealth, and that's what saved us.
Our viewers have seen that news across the screen there. Tony Smith, the Speaker, won't contest the next election. He's put out a statement. He's the member for Casey and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and has been the best speaker that I can remember. I've been here since 2003, been through quite a few of them. He was easily the best.
Yeah, I agree. Tony Smith and I actually started as staffers around the same time, so he's been a long-term friend, a great political brain. He will be a loss for the coalition. I think he's been an absolutely excellent speaker, one of the best. You go back to Stephen Cunningham, I think it was, who in Labor, who I think was really succeeded in that role as well. But he'll be a loss. But he's been in that seat now for over 20 years, I think. So he's probably taken the decision with a young family. It's time to move on.
Yeah,
to
20
other
years this November. So it's quite a stint.
I think you say he's a loss for the coalition. I think he's a loss for the parliament and a loss for our democracy. Him and the Senate President, Scott Ryan, also going this year. He is a great Senate President. Two of the great presiding officers that I can remember are going. He's led the House with integrity through difficult times. Overall, I think it's a loss for democracy, both of them going at the next election.
Yeah,
I totally agree.
I'll add my sentiments to that.
Nice to finish on a bipartisan nature for a change. Gents, great to see you, Ben and David. We'll see you soon. Let's check.
20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.